We're speaking with Donald Trott, retail analyst with Dean Witter Reynolds. Don, welcome to the Dow Jones Investor Network.
Thank you, Leslie. It's good to be here.
You put out a very interesting report recently that had a thesis about Generation X and the baby boomers and how they relate to specialty retailing. Before we talk about your thesis involving Generation X, I think we need to put it in some sort of a context. So why don't you start by talking about the 1980s, the whole approach to consumerism on the part of the baby boom generation, and we'll get into how that's changed in the 90s in a moment.
Okay. I think there were two important threads that ran through consumer spending in the 80s, particularly as it applied to the baby boom generation. And it should be kept in mind that because the baby boom generation was the generation that in that era was generating the bulk of the incremental consumer demand, that was the group that all advertisers and the media tried to form a bond with. So there was a ripple effect, and the influences of that generation's propensities carried through society in general. And the two important threads, I think, in the 1980s with respect to that overwhelming baby boom generation were, number one, they went through what we characterize as being an adolescent moratorium. And by adolescent moratorium, what I mean is they deferred the assumption of more normal adult responsibilities. They didn't get married, they didn't buy homes, they didn't have children. As a result of that, their financial responsibility tended to be limited strictly to oneself. And that was very conducive to a frivolous and impulsive kind of orientation towards consumption. And I think that in the 80s, which will contrast as we get to it with the 90s, as a result of that, shopping became a recreational activity. And I think that you saw throngs of people in the mall, essentially with the perspective of I'm going shopping, I don't know what I'm going to buy or where I'm going to buy it, I simply know I'm going shopping. And it was recreational. The other key thread, which I think is very important, that influenced those spending patterns in the 80s was a result of the cultural backdrop in which that generation came of age. All throughout their childhood and teenage years and so forth, the media, their educators, and their politicians kept declaring that this was the generation that was going to have it all. And as they arrived in adulthood, there was a prosperous period, it was, okay, here we are, we're going to have it all, we're ready to have it all. The thing was, no one had ever defined to them along the way what this all was that they were supposed to have, which was kind of an interesting thing. So what you had was a reaching out for outside authority to validate spending patterns, to say to them, yes, this is what someone who has it all has. So as a result of that, in the apparel sector, for example, they saluted anything that 7th Avenue put forth. If 7th Avenue had said, dress like the Michelin Man, they would have dressed like the Michelin Man. And it carried through all the spending patterns. I mean, for example, the icon of someone who had it all in the 80s, I guess, was Michael Jordan. And so therefore, everyone wanted to be like Mike. And Mike wore high-performance basketball shoes because he's a basketball player. That kind of got overlooked. So everyone wore high-performance basketball shoes. And it was the same thing with Perrier and the prestigious ice creams and so forth. It was the seeking of outside authority to validate that you were someone who had it all, and that was really the key to those consumption patterns in the 80s.
We'll follow up on the boomers in a moment and where they're at this point in time. But Generation X, how does the Generation X approach differ, if you will, from that consumerism of the 80s?
Yeah, Generation X is kind of interesting. It's a 180-degree difference as we see it. In contrast with the baby boom generation, who was raised with, you're going to have it all, Generation X is the first generation in the history of the United States. It's a very, very key change. First generation in U.S. history to be raised with the belief that not only aren't you going to have it better than the generation that preceded you, you're probably not even going to have it as good. And that has never happened before. And as a result of that, there is a sense of complete rejection of this outside authority that was validating expenditure patterns in the 80s. There's a sense that I cannot aspire to meet these standards, therefore I reject them entirely, and it's an anti-establishment kind of approach, and it's a much more practical approach. It's limited dollars, and it's a investment consumption kind of approach. By investment consumption, what I mean is expenditures are oriented towards the optimization of longevity of usage of the items purchased, be they apparel or hard goods or whatever. And as a result of that, and then it ties in with where the baby boom generation is today, but what's happened is shopping has become much more utilitarian, deliberate in the thought process, store-specific, item-specific, destination-oriented, completely different than what we had in the 80s.
So no more trolling of the malls, as you put it.
Now, there's no more trolling in the malls, and in fact, even with that baby boom generation, what has happened is they have now been pursuing in more recent years what the Republicans would characterize as being traditional family values, and it's a pursuit of marriage, having children, buying homes, and so on. And as a result of that, their financial profile has changed very materially. Now suddenly, off of the top, there is a mortgage payment to be made, children to not only be cared for, but whose education has to be provided for, so the setting aside of money for education. At the same time, the older half of the baby boom generation are now in their 40s, and the realization has set in that retirement isn't just something that their fathers someday do, but that they too will retire, and we have the setting aside of money for that retirement. As a result of those two, retirement on the one hand and children's education on the other hand, that's what has ignited and perpetuated the mutual fund boom, and we think that continues. And another force, which I think has just started to influence that generation, but it's going to become increasingly important over the next 5, 10 years, whatever, is the need to provide financial assistance to aging parents. And that's going to be another big drain. So as a result, that generation also is becoming much more deliberate and thoughtful in their expenditure patterns, and again is going towards this investment consumption kind of approach. So you have the baby boom generation going more towards investment consumption, being more squeezed, Generation X going in that way, and then the two of them in total are enormous in size. I mean, baby boom generation is 70 million people, and Generation X, well, some of them are infants still, it starts with 1964, that's 80 million people. And there are so many people involved that, again, their patterns kind of reverberate throughout society and influence everyone else. Another thing that should be mentioned in this regard is that what the U.S. government numbers show, and it's kind of interesting, is that notwithstanding the prosperity, the economic expansion that the United States has been going through, we've had 4 straight years now where the median family income has declined. And there is a widening gap between the compensation available to technologically skilled members of the labor force and the rest. And there's been more of a commoditization of less skilled labor. And as a result, all of the gains really in household income on a per unit basis have been going to the upper 20% of the households. So household income is coming down, and this again is a factor that's causing this more deliberate, more sober approach to spending.
Given these two demographic groups and this convergence, if you will, toward this this consumption, this investment consumption approach, what retailers are poised to benefit from this, and what retailers have a lot of work cut out for them?
Right. Okay, well, I think that what you have, first of all, is that this investment consumption carries through to everything. And as a result of this greater emphasis on longevity of usage, within the apparel component, everything has gone towards staples, classics, basics, things where the longevity of usage is limited strictly by wear and tear. And we believe very firmly that this is a secular change. In other words, this is not a lot of other observers of the industry keep talking about the fashion cycle and the alleged fashion cycle and how it's due to change and so on. That's gone on for 4 or 5 years now. There's been no change. It's all been staples, basics, classics. That has very bad implications for most apparel retailers, particularly specialty apparel retailers. Number one, as a result of that, available gross margins have come down. Differentiation is margin opportunity. Commoditization is reduced margin opportunity. So that's bad. The second thing that's happened is this more rational and thoughtful consumer has induced a downward migration in average price point mix, so that it takes more units to generate the same amount of dollar sales. On some of the expenses, like if you take mall rents, for example, you need 3 to 5% dollar older store sales gains per annum to have a flat rent to sales ratio. And so if, let's say, the average price point is down 2%, now it means you need a 5 to 7% unit older store sales increase. And many companies are unable to generate that kind of increase. And at the same time, not only do you have items like rents that are going up, but even the past ability to leverage some of these expense factors is greatly reduced by that downward migration and price point mix, and therefore constraint on older store dollar sales gains. The other thing that's happening to the specialty apparel retailers, and my area of concentration is the specialty apparels. I have a colleague, Patrick McCormick, that does general merchandise companies. But what's happening in the specialty area is they're also losing market share to the anchor stores, the department stores, and the Walmarts and so on. And so that further exacerbates the problem. And they're losing it, number one, because shopping is now utilitarian. So it's a lot easier to go to the anchor department store, shop outside, just go in the store, get your purchase over with, than trolling the mall. Number two, people have think in advance as to what they want to buy. There's the commoditization of apparel. If you want to buy a white skirt or a blue blazer or something, the department store has it. You're not interested in what's fashion forward in the little boutiques. And then you have this other factor, that the department store, being multi-departmental, has now become a favorable attribute again, because shopping is no nonsense. And if I want to buy a toaster, a blazer, and an umbrella, let's say, buy them all on a one-stop basis. And then the other thing, which is really a major influence going on here, is the department stores used to be noted not that long ago, 4 or 5 years ago, for high markup, full markup. At that time, their focus was on name brands. The focus has now shifted very drastically over the private label. And private label, they're giving the consumer better value. The consumer, as I said, is trading down price point-wise. And so those general merchandise companies are taking share. So the backdrop for specialty apparel retailers as a sector is a very, very challenging one. Now, notwithstanding that, incidentally, the market has recognized that, and at this point, and some of these have been beaten down to points where we feel purchases can be made, although with the recognition that you're sort of running up the down escalator, that you're fighting an adverse backdrop. But Gap, we had upped at 31 to a buy. We don't expect anything much there until the spring, when the focus will move towards Old Navy. We upped earlier this week, limited to an accumulate. We think that the Street will start to look at them a little differently after they announce their full-year earnings in terms of the mix of those earnings. But where we have been and where we're more excited is over on some of these hard good components of the consumer economy. We've been very aggressive in things like the home center chains, the consumer electronics premier chains, and we continue to have a lot of focus in that arena. The home center area is not only an important beneficiary of the turning towards home and family, but also all forms of U.S. commercial and industrial activity, including retailing, trends ultimately to consolidation, to oligopoly. We've had it in discount department stores, membership warehouse clubs, and so on. And on the various markets that the home center chains impact, we see that as being in the early stages, but accelerating rapidly. And so we see good things ahead there, continuing for Home Depot and Lowe's companies. We think they're both going to be very rewarding. I mean, I think that what investors tend to do is, we all do it, I mean, I've done it, you've done it, and so on, is at times we make this overly complicated. I mean, you got any watering hole in any financial community in the United States, and you'll hear people talking about how, you know, on my fourth try, I did this thing with moths and butterflies and so on, you know, and I made 2 points or whatever it is. And on the other hand, you hear somebody pipe up and say, well, gee, you know, I made 8 times my money in Walmart the last decade, and it's, oh, you bought Walmart, big deal, you know, because it's not creative enough. We overly complicate it. But I think this Lowe's Home Depot thing is a story that is still in the early stages, is going to go on for many years. Best Buy in the consumer electronics area is a company that we are very, very intrigued with. I think that Best Buy is going to emerge, first of all, as the national information superhighway superstore. Have done an incredible job in building a very compelling power presence in so many of these segments, not only the traditional consumer electronics and white goods appliances, but more significantly and more recently in things like music software. I mean, their new Concept 3 stores have 65,000 SKUs, stock keeping units of music, an enormous power presentation in the computer area. In fact, even software, they're carrying 2,000 SKUs and so on. And they're the first ones that have seriously taken on Radio Shack Tandy in terms of a power presence and accessories. I mean, the backbone of Tandy has always been that you go in and you buy a little wire for $2 1/4, and that wire costs them 14 cents. And so Best Buy is doing a great job there. But the other thing that Best Buy is doing, there are a handful of retailers in both hard goods and soft goods who have, in our judgment, reasonably successfully tapped into this Generation X, and that's the growth of where it's all coming from. And Generation X, I mean, among its characteristics, these kids were all raised with computers from the times they were infants, and video games and so on. All this stuff is second nature to them. And also, as I indicated, they have rejected outside authority dictating what your expenditure pattern should be. And so we have in this consumer electronics thing kind of an interesting dichotomy shaping up. Circuit City has always been characterized by a very knowledgeable, very good sales force, and that sales force validates your purchase. They work with you and give you the assurance you have done the right thing. And this is a baby boom generation outside authority thing. Best Buy is over on the other side. Best Buy, while the sales assistance is there if you want it, it's not as intense and it's not as imposed on you. And in their new Concept 3 stores, they have in each of the stores 12 kiosks which have a computer, and you go in there and essentially do your own product research, and it's very exciting. And they also work in some entertainment gimmicks into using those computers. But you can get any product characteristics arrayed in any manner you want, and so on, and where it is. And so they've done a very good job there. So Best Buy, I think, is another company. Best Buy, Lowe's, Home Depot would be the three that we feel are really well positioned in terms of where both generations are going, baby boom and Generation X, and in terms of where we see an increased allocation of consumer spending over the next several years. On the apparel side, there are three companies, I guess, which have formed some kind of bond with Generation X. One is American Eagle Outfitters, another one is Pacific Sunwear, and the third one is Urban Outfitters. And it's kind of interesting watching their results versus the results of some of the other apparel companies in this environment who who have struggled to a lot greater degree. And so I think over the years, while these things are volatile, they're getting hurt by the weather along with everybody else temporarily. Somewhere along the line, those should be interesting stocks as well.
It's interesting because when you're mentioning American Eagle and these other companies, I mean, the Gap is noticeably absent from that group. Mm-hmm. And even though you recently upped the Gap for other reasons, because of valuation or whatever, because those stocks are getting hit, where does the Gap fit into this? Because a lot of the advertising we're seeing for the Gap now is geared, I mean, we're seeing ads now with, parents and the kids in these groovy clothes. But what about Generation X? How do they relate to the Gap?
All right, what's happened with Gap is a brilliant marketing company. And Gap, if you go back 10 or 12 years ago, Gap was a store whose customer base was essentially teenagers and blue-collar families. They did a brilliant job in expanding that market, and 2 or 3 years ago had reached the point where Gap was everybody's store. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, the chief executive officer of Dow Jones or the lowest paid messenger in Dow Jones could both walk down the street with a Gap shopping bag, and neither one would feel self-conscious or look out of place. It was everyone's store. Now, what's happened is 2 things. Number one, this commoditization of apparel that we alluded to before, which has reduced available gross margins. And so that has caused Gap to rethink its strategy, because, again, Gap has been a mall-based retailer. We have some inflation in there and so on. So it's a new set of challenges. The other thing is Gap in the United States, its store count is reasonably mature. While they've been expanding square footage, it's been replacement. The store count has been flattish. So the challenge is, number one, how do you up margins in the face of this challenging environment? And number two, how do you find new opportunities for expansion within the United States? So what they essentially did was they have left behind the lower 30-40% of the economic spectrum and said, fashion can give us greater margin, fashion can give us higher price points, so we're not going to go crazy, but we are going to have more fashion, and it's really been kind of a yuppification of Gap. Now, at the same time, and they have gotten, in the 12 months ended July, for example, we estimate that their merchandise margin went up 700 basis points. So they successfully did that. And at the same time, by leaving behind a segment of the market, it gave them someone else to go after now without self-cannibalization, which would have been an issue before. And so they now have this new chain, Old Navy, which is a family-oriented, good value chain, not directly competitive. I mean, all apparel chains compete with each other to some degree, but when I say not directly competitive, they're non-mall environment stores. They tend to be strips. And whereas a Gap, for example, will make available to you, the consumer, let's say a turtleneck jersey that's 100% cotton, you'll get a similar type jersey in Old Navy that'll be a blend of polyester and cotton. So it's a different quality, but it's very good. It's very good value. And again, we see it on this positioning. I mean, we have referred to American Eagle, for example, as being the anti-Gap. In other words, American Eagle, it's lower price points. It's more the traditional base, 80% male. See, as part of this upgrading of price point mix, more fashion on the part of Gap, Gap has swung from what 10 years ago was 20% female to 2.5, 3 years ago, 30% female to 60% female now. And there has been some alienation of the male customer. Gap is very smart. They key into this and are taking the steps. They've changed how the store is being set and so on. And in fact, after that became apparent, which was back to school, here in the World Trade Center, World Financial Center complex, there was a Gap store which for a week, one whole window was filled with a sign that said haberdashery, and gave a dictionary definition, a purveyor of men's furnishings, essentially saying, hey, look, guys, you know, we really are your store. And they're doing things to change that. But that has gone, basically, it's a more yuppified baby boom generation store. American Eagle is the anti-Gap. Similar to what we're seeing in apparel is we see Tommy Hilfiger as the anti-Ralph, and it's the same. And so you have this whole dichotomy kind of developing out there.
Finally, Don, here we are a number of days before Christmas. What are your views on how this Christmas season is likely to shape up?
All right. Well, first of all, what we say every year, and it's not new, it's a cliche, and yet the conventional wisdom seems to avoid. I was very happy to see Jim Nordstrom of Nordstrom quoted in Women's Wear recently, essentially saying something to the effect that all that's going on in here is static. The whole thing is the last 3 or 4 days, and that's kind of what our view is. But what has become very clear is, I mean, first of all, the conventional forecast and my forecast as well has been 5.5 to 6% increase, and that's still kind of where we are. But what's become very clear is that the apparel situation is awful, and part of that is this consumer who is more deliberate in making his or her spending decisions is only buying apparel on the basis of need, and at this time of the year, while we all focus on the holiday giving, this is also the season when people generally buy cold weather apparel if there's cold weather. And unfortunately, we don't have cold weather. In New York today, as you know, it's 55 degrees, or will be 55 degrees. So that the apparel component has been awful. The hard goods side is good. And but to give you an idea on the apparel side, what's happening is, take Lerner, for example. Lerner not only has a wide array of planned promotions that had been incorporated, but this past weekend, Lerner that went to 50% off everything in the store, on top of the already marked down prices, and we're getting some rumblings that there may be further markdowns coming the next day or two. It's I don't think it's going to be as bad as last year. Last year, some of these limited companies, by the end of the year, I mean, they went at the end of the season, they were at one point buy one get one free, then went to buy one get 2 free. And then the alarm went off and said it's Christmas, because we were waiting for the sale that was going to be buy one, we'll give you the store. And I don't think it's going to be that bad, but it's gotten very, very bad in here. And the margins are going to get hit on these apparel companies.
Don Trott, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Well, thank you very much. A happy holiday to you.
Same to you.
Thank you.